Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I knew the room would tilt in her favor the second the glasses started clinking and people pulled out their phones like this was a coronation instead of an anniversary dinner, and I knew because this is how it has always gone in our family. Where my mother finds a way to turn any occasion into an Emily appreciation segment with me cast as the supporting act who should clap and keep her opinions to herself. So when she lifted her glass, smiled right at my sister, and said, to the daughter who never let me down, I felt the old heat crawl up my neck, the kind that used to make me swallow hard and tell myself to be gracious, to be fair, to be the bigger person. But this time the words hit me like a dare instead of a verdict. And before anyone could giggle or add their little supportive chorus, I pushed my chair back, stood up slow enough to make people look, and placed the folder right in the center of the table like it belonged there more than the centerpieces or the layered cake. Someone spent a week bragging about, and I said, that's funny, because this just arrived for her, and I watched the color fall out of Emily's face so fast I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But not enough to pick the folder back up and apologize for interrupting the parade. You know that feeling when your body expects the usual script and you choose a different line anyway, when the muscle memory of keeping quiet collides with the rush that comes from finally drawing a line in permanent ink, because that is what happened. And I did not whisper, I did not joke, I did not hedge the way I used to when I would try to ask for basic respect and get told I was being dramatic. I simply set down the folder like a bill at the end of a long meal that no one wanted to admit. They ordered, and I let the silence do the heavy lifting, because silence, when used at the right time, is not passive or weak. It is a spotlight that forces people to see what they would rather not, and as I stood there, hands steady in a way that surprised even me, I saw my mother's smile stiffen into that tight look she uses when the world refuses to act according to her outline, and I thought, good, let's have this conversation where everyone can hear it for once. If you are wondering whether I planned it, whether I chose that night because I wanted the maximum embarrassment, I will tell you something you already know in your gut, which is that people like my mother only understand stakes when an audience is present. And for years I tried to handle things privately, and for years the outcome never changed, which meant the outcome was the point. So I learned and I adapted and I waited, and I brought that folder the way people carry a wallet, not to flash it around, but because I knew a moment would come when I would need it, and when she lifted her glass and said those words, the moment introduced itself like an old friend who finally shows up. I did not open the folder right away, and I did not explain what was inside, because explanations are gifts I give to people who have earned them, and Emily has collected more gifts than she ever deserved. While I have collected reminders to smile and not make waves and be happy for others, so instead I looked at my sister the way you look at someone who has rehearsed a spotless version of herself for so long she believes it, and I said, it is yours, you go ahead. And I slid it toward her fingers, and when she did not reach for it, I knew that the balance had already shifted, because the version of Emily that my mother worships would have lifted that folder like it was a harmless card and made a performance out of gratitude. But the version sitting across from me stared the way someone stares at a road sign that suddenly says "Bridge out." People tried to fill the quiet, because grown adults are allergic to unscripted tension, and a cousin made a clumsy joke that died halfway out of his mouth, and an uncle cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a ruling from a bench he does not own. And my mother said my name with that warning tone that used to stop me cold when I was a teenager, except I am not a teenager and the warning belongs to someone else now, and I said, we can keep toasts short tonight, and I sat down, because once you push the first domino, you do not need to keep flicking at the rest, you just let gravity do what it always does. I am not going to pretend I did not feel something complicated along with the adrenaline, because I did. I felt the little girl who used to try twice as hard for half the recognition standing in the doorway asking whether this was necessary. And I answered her as calmly as I could, which is to say I reminded her of all the times we swallowed it, all the times we let the benefit of the doubt sit where our backbone should have been, and how none of that bought us even basic fairness, and if you have lived this, you already get it, because there is a moment when you realize that being kind to people who weaponize your kindness is just a gift to their laziness, and I am done giving out that particular discount. Emily finally reached out, The way a person reaches out when the box on the porch has no return address, and the dog will not go near it, and she pulled the folder close but kept the cover shut. And she said my name like she was trying to coax me back into a smaller version of myself, and I said, if you think it is a misunderstanding, you should open it and clear it up, and I kept my voice even because I did not need anger, I needed clarity. And clarity was already doing laps around the table as eyes moved between us and my mother, who kept smiling a smile that looked like it hurt. You might be waiting for me to tell you what was inside, and trust me, I have been waiting a long time to say it out loud, but part of winning is pacing, and part of justice is letting the person who built the tower announce the cracks themselves. So I will tell you only this for now, it was not gossip. It was not some old teenage mistake dragged out for shock value. It was paper, it was official, and it was the kind of paper that changes the temperature of a room without anyone touching the thermostat. And as Emily stared at the closed cover like a person bargaining with an elevator door, I leaned back and decided I was not going to be the one to open it. Not tonight, not after that toast. My mother put her glass down and told everyone that families have inside jokes, that this was a misunderstanding, that I had always had a flair for drama, and I let her talk because talking was all she had left, and I watched the guests do the math quietly. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed, and I waited for the thing I knew was coming, which was the moment when Emily would try to change the subject, to redirect, to ask about the cake or the music or the photos, because deflection is her favorite sport. And when she opened her mouth to pivot, one of our aunts reached forward and lifted the cover herself, because there is always one person in every family who gets tired of pretending not to see. The cover came back, the first few pages slid into view, and I did not say a word, because the point of the folder was never my voice. It was the truth that sits fine inside a drawer until the right light hits it. And when my aunt's eyebrows went up and she looked from the paper to Emily and then to my mother, the room finally felt honest, and, honestly, it felt like fresh air after a stale flight. Not pleasant, not pretty, but real in a way we had avoided for years. And I let the moment breathe, while I stared at my water and waited for the next sound, knowing exactly which one it would be, because the first person to speak next would tell you everything about their role in what comes after, and I promise you, it was not me. And before you ask whether I second-guessed any of it, whether I wished I had let the toast finish and the cake get cut and the speeches wrap up with the usual rehearsed warmth, I will tell you that I've spent too many years being the one who goes home with a swallowed tongue and a chewed-up heart, and tonight I decided to leave with something different. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but balance. And if that balance had to arrive inside a plain folder in the middle of a celebratory table, then maybe that says more about how we celebrate in this family than it does about me. And as I sat there, calm in a way that felt new, I heard a chair scrape, and I knew what was coming next would make the toast look like a warm-up. If you want to understand why that folder mattered, you have to understand the rhythm of our house where praise was a currency with Emily's face on it, and I was expected to pay exact change for every tiny thing I asked for. Because growing up under my mother's version of fairness meant that Emily's lost homework was blamed on a teacher who clearly disliked gifted children while my perfect attendance was treated as basic hygiene. And Emily's last-minute college application essays were celebrated as a sign of raw genius, while my scholarship offer was dismissed as a clerical error some office would fix once they realized whose daughter I was. And if you think I am exaggerating, then you have never sat through a birthday where your mother gives your sister a sentimental speech about promise and possibility, and then hands you a practical gift with a receipt tucked on top, just in case your taste runs sensible instead of special. It was not one dramatic betrayal that did it, not a single slap across the face or a screaming match in a driveway, and maybe that would have been easier. Because it is the slow, steady stuff that gets inside your bones and convinces you that asking for equal treatment is rude. And I carried that message through high school and college and into my first job, where I learned to be the person who fixes problems in the background while someone else gets introduced as the solution. And there is a kind of muscle that builds when you hold back, a muscle that lets you swallow words and smile even when your jaw wants to lock. And I was good at it, too good. So good that by the time our dad got sick and bills started stacking, I was the one who set up automatic payments and tracked every statement while Emily posted photos about how family is everything, and our mother clapped along because that is what she knows how to do, clap for the picture and ignore the spreadsheet. I used to think if I just kept showing up, kept doing the responsible thing without demanding credit, my mother would look up one day and see me plainly, not as the alternate or the understudy, but as a daughter who held the line when things were hard. And it took me far too long to realize that people who benefit from your silence have no incentive to hand you a microphone, and once that landed, I started making small adjustments that looked like nothing from the outside, but felt huge inside my own head, like saying no to the little errands that always landed on my lap and not explaining the no for 3 paragraphs, or leaving texts on read when the only reason they were sent was to make sure I would fill in a gap someone else left on purpose. And when I tell you that these tiny refusals felt like petty revenge, I am not ashamed, because sometimes you have to practice before you can play the real game. There were moments that still sting when I think about them, like the day our mother told a room full of relatives that Emily had paid a medical bill none of us could cover, and I stood there with the bank record on my phone. The one that showed the payment had gone through my account after I cut back on my own rent and picked up extra hours at work, and I remember looking at Emily across the room and watching her do that demure shrug she does when credit looks good on her. And I said nothing. Because I had spent a lifetime believing that correcting the record made me the difficult one, and that night I went home and could not sleep, because there is a special kind of anger reserved for times you betray yourself to keep the peace. And I decided I was done being the quiet bookkeeper of my own erasure. The change did not arrive with confetti and cheering. It arrived through the most boring door you can imagine, which was the door of paperwork and policy and access, because after our dad passed, there were accounts and a trust and the kind of adult logistics that families avoid discussing until someone finally says out loud that the money intended for long-term stability has a way of evaporating when no one is looking. And I was tired of pretending not to notice evaporation, so I did the least dramatic, most effective thing I could think of, which was to request, formally and in writing, every statement and disbursement record that I was entitled to see as a beneficiary, and I CC'd the trustee. And I used polite language that left no room for misunderstanding, and when the administrator asked why I needed archival statements instead of the last year, I said that clarity is not a one-page concept. And I said it with a smile that did not ask permission. You might say that is not revenge, that is housekeeping, but let me tell you what it felt like. It felt like pulling the first thread on a sweater everyone keeps complimenting without noticing the loose stitching under the arm. And I knew exactly whose hands had been tugging at that thread in private, because the calendar of transfers did not match the calendar of needs, and while I did not yet have proof of the thing that would later sit in that folder like a lit match in a dry field, I had enough to know that the story we were being fed about who sacrifices what in this family was a fairy tale told to keep one audience clapping and the other working the concession stand. I did not confront anyone in the kitchen or stage a tearful intervention in a living room, because I have learned that open conflict is a gift to people who thrive on performance, and my sister thrives on performance, so instead I sent one more message, this time to the trustee, and I asked that alerts be added to my email for any disbursement over a modest threshold, and I put that request in writing with the exact clause from the document that allowed it, and when he responded that it was reasonable and would be implemented immediately, I felt a click inside my chest, the kind that happens when a door you have been pushing finally swings the right way, and for the first time in a long time. I did not need my mother's version of validation to feel upright. Here is the part one want you to hear, because this is when the wins started to count, not in applause or bouquets, but in the way the ground moved, small and steady, under my choices, and the very next week an alert landed in my inbox late in the afternoon. And I stared at the amount and the description and the timing, and I knew in my bones that the person who never lets our mother down had been counting on no one watching the ledger, and I smiled in a way that was not nice at all, and I replied to the trustee with a simple acknowledgement that the alert had been received, copied the archive request thread, and said I would circle back with questions soon. Which is a sentence that sounds polite and lands like a warning to anyone who understands where the paper leads, and that night, for the first time in years, I slept. If you want to call that petty, call it petty. If you want to call it administrative, but I call it the first real step toward getting my hands back on the steering wheel of a story I had been forced to ride in the back of. And when our mother later bragged about Emily helping with retirement planning, I looked at my sister and did not look away because I was done behaving like a witness who forgot to take notes, and by the time the anniversary invite showed up with the usual expectant tone, I already knew I would bring a folder, not to make a scene, but to end one, and the moment she raised that glass and said those words, the long email thread in my pocket turned into a blade I did not have to swing to make it cut. When that first alert landed and I realized the amount did not line up with any bill my mother had mentioned or any plan we had agreed on, I did the most boring and most powerful thing I could think of, which was to sit down with a notepad and write out every transfer for the past few years in plain language. Not because I love homework, but because patterns get shy when you only glance at them, and as the lines filled up and the dates started to repeat like a drumbeat, I saw that certain withdrawals showed up right before weekends, right after family events, and right before my sister posted one more humble brag about taking care of things for our mom, which might have passed for coincidence if the descriptions on the statements had not been vague to the point of comedy, little phrases that told you nothing while pretending to tell you everything, and I knew then that I was not imagining this. I was just finally looking in a way I had been trained not to. I did not call Emily, and I did not text my mother, because I have learned that you do not alert a magician while you are standing behind the curtain, so instead I called the trustee and said I had a few questions that would be easier in person. And I arrived with a copy of the trust document, a simple list of disbursement rules highlighted in the same calm color you might use to mark a grocery item, and I asked him to walk me through the oversight process the way you might ask an accountant to explain a tax line you have always ignored, and he was professional and clear and maybe a little embarrassed that I knew the sections better than he did, and when we were done, I asked him a plain question that sounded innocent, which was whether any beneficiary had ever requested wires to a personal account for reimbursement without providing receipts as required, and he paused long enough to tell me the answer before he actually spoke it, and then he admitted that yes, reimbursements had been processed on trust and on timelines that did not always include backup, and I nodded and said thank you and asked him, very politely, to send me the authorization emails for any transaction approved under that practice. The emails told their own story, and it was one I knew by heart even before I saw the details, because the authorization chain ran through my mother's address, which we all know my sister manages on the regular because our mother treats tech like a prank from the universe, and attached to these authorization notes were little justifications typed in my mother's voice, but not my mother's style. Little blurbs that used words our mother would never put together, but that Emily loves, and I did not need a handwriting expert to know who had done the typing. I needed a spine, and luckily the past year had given me one, so I printed the messages, filed them neatly, and then did something that changed the whole posture of the game, which was to request independent verification from the vendors named as reasons for the reimbursements, and I kept those requests simple and kind, asking if any invoice existed under our mother's name for the dates in question, and whether a payment had failed and whether a replacement payment had been requested by a family member. The replies arrived in a trickle, and each one closed a door, because vendor after vendor said no invoice existed, or that the bill on that date had been paid by the insurance, or that the number did not match anything they recognized. And with each no, the noise in my head got quieter, not because I wanted a scandal, but because proof calmed the part of me that still worried I might be misreading the room, and once the pattern reached a point where even a generous person would stop giving the benefit of the doubt, I took the next step that people think is dramatic, but is actually plain common sense, and I asked a friend who works in compliance to look over the folder with me in my kitchen. Not to gossip, but to make sure I was not about to set something on fire that would burn my mother along with my sister, and my friend flipped through the pages, asked a few pointed questions, and finally said the sentence that welded my resolve in place, which was that if I did not intervene, I would be complicit in letting my mother's future get siphoned in service of my sister's image. I am not naive, and I know that families handle money in messy ways, And I know that sometimes you spot a line that looks off and discover a boring answer, but this was not a boring answer. This was a structure built on the assumption that no one would read the fine print, and I decided I would read all of it, so I made 2 sets of the folder, one for me and one sealed with a simple note that said, "Keep this with the trust records." And I walked that second copy to the trustee's office and asked for a time-stamped receipt, and when he asked if there was a problem, I smiled the kind of smile that means the problem has already been named, and I said this is just good housekeeping, which it was, and it was also the setup for what would come next. There was a moment that week when I almost sent a long message to my mother explaining everything, because old habits do not die, they negotiate, and the part of me that still wants to be understood was begging for an early conversation. But another part of me, the part that has learned the cost of prematurely sharing, reminded me that the only way to stop the leak was to show it to the person benefiting from it in a place where spin would not save her, and that meant waiting, and I am telling you waiting is its own discipline, because I had to sit on my hands while my sister posted one more carefully framed update about being the backbone of this family, and my mother added a heart to it, and relatives chimed in with praise. And I let the comments stack, because the tower falls harder when it is higher, and I was not going to push, I was going to pull one pin and let gravity do what it is built to do. You might think the plan was simply to expose the documents in front of everyone and let the pieces scatter, but that would have been too easy to dismiss as me being vindictive, so I added one more layer, a clean one, by preparing a short letter to the trustee requesting that, effective immediately, any disbursement over a modest level required joint authorization from both beneficiaries. And I asked that this policy be presented to our mother for signature in a neutral meeting after the anniversary dinner, and I copied my own email on the draft with a future send time set for the morning after the party, and I printed that scheduler confirmation and tucked it behind the last page in the folder. Because my goal was not to win an argument, my goal was to change the rules back to what they were always supposed to be, and to do it in a way that could not be undone by tears or theatrics. So when I tell you that walking into that dinner with the folder did not feel like marching into war, but like showing up to close a tab that should have been closed months ago, I mean it. And when my mother raised her glass and delivered that line that has been echoing through my head since childhood, I did not see red. I saw a door opening onto the exact scene I had prepared for, and I chose to step through it without commentary, and now you know why. Because the paper had already spoken, the vendors had already answered, the trustee had already stamped his receipt, and all that remained was to let the person who never lets anyone down try to explain to a room of adults why her name kept showing up on withdrawals that solved problems no one had, and to decide, in full view, whether she wanted to open that folder or pretend it was not there, which, for someone like Emily, is not a choice at all. It is a spotlight, and I was done dimming it for her. The chair that scraped was my aunt's, the one who has always cut through the nonsense at family gatherings by asking the question everyone is scared to ask, and when she slid the folder closer and lifted the cover, I did not lean in like a hungry spectator, because I had already memorized every page. Instead, I sat back and watched the faces around me make the same calculations I had made alone. And I could tell the exact second the first page landed in her brain, because her mouth pressed into that line she gets when she reads something that insults her intelligence, and she looked at Emily in a way that said, "Explain this to me like I am not an idiot," and my sister did what she always does under pressure. She tried to laugh it off. Said the papers were out of context, said there were technicalities, said I was making a scene to ruin a nice evening, and my aunt nodded slowly the way a person nods when they are giving you enough rope to either pull yourself out or tie a neat little knot. And then she flipped to the next page and the next, and the room got very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with people realizing that the story they had been clapping for had chapters no one mentioned. My mother reached for the folder with a shaky hand and told my aunt she could handle it, which would have been funny if it were not so familiar. Because handling it in our family has always meant protecting Emily from consequences while calling me dramatic for suggesting consequences should exist, but my aunt did not let go. She kept one hand on the page and said a single mild sentence about wanting clarity, and she asked Emily, not me, to explain why reimbursements were approved without receipts. why the vendor names did not match the bills we all heard about, and why transfers were made to an account that did not belong to our mother, but did belong to a person whose initials matched the monogram on my sister's email signature. And I watched Emily pull out that tired script where she mixes a little guilt, a little fake confusion, and a lot of fast talking, and I felt something inside me settle, because for once the performance was not landing. A cousin cleared his throat and asked if this was about a misunderstanding with insurance, and Emily grabbed onto that like a life raft, said yes, exactly, mix-ups and timing and coverage gaps, and I let her talk until she ran out of vague words. And then I said in the same calm voice I had used all night that I had already checked with the vendors named in those notes, and none of them had any record of outstanding invoices on those dates, and the cousin looked at me and then at the paper's end. Then back at Emily, and he did not say anything, which was louder than any speech he could have made, and my mother told me to stop, said I was embarrassing myself, and I said I was done being embarrassed for doing the unglamorous work of reading what people sign. And I meant it, because shame had been the currency used to keep me quiet for a long time, and I had converted it to something more useful. You could feel the room shift from friendly to serious, like when a meeting goes from small talk to agenda, and the first person to actually ask a concrete question was Emily's husband, who has always treated family events like chances to win points for being supportive, and he asked, very carefully, what exactly was inside the folder, and my aunt answered before I could. Said it looked like a set of authorizations for trust reimbursements that did not meet the basic rules of the document, said. It looked like someone had been moving money under the radar, and then she pointed to the line that showed a wire marked as urgent for a purpose that could not be confirmed by any vendor, and she read the amount out loud. And that was the moment when Emily's husband's face changed the way only a spouse's face changes, from annoyed to worried to angry, and he asked Emily if this was true, and Emily stared at him and said the most predictable sentence in the world, which was that I was twisting things to get attention. I did not raise my voice, because volume is a trick that people use when they lack proof, and I had proof, so I kept it straight and said I had given a sealed copy of the folder to the trustee earlier that week, and that a time-stamped receipt existed, and that an email requesting tightened controls was scheduled to go out in the morning, and I said it in that matter-of-fact way that leaves no wiggle room for spin, and you could feel people recalibrate, because it is one thing to call your sister dramatic, it is another to call a timestamp imaginary, and my mother tried to regain control by saying we should not be airing private matters in front of guests, which would have been a fine point if she had not just delivered a public toast ranking her daughters like employees at a sales banquet, and I said, calmly, that transparency is not humiliation, it is protection. And that was when Emily finally snapped at me and accused me of wanting to destroy her life. Here is the part where I admit something that will not make me look noble, which is that a piece of me enjoyed hearing her say those words, not because I want her life destroyed, I do not, but because it was the first honest sentence she had spoken all night. Since we both knew the only life at risk of real damage was the one she had built on other people's patience, and I told her, still calm, that if her life could be destroyed by people seeing the truth about where the money went, then her issue was not me. And I pushed the folder a little closer to her side of the table so she would have to either touch it or keep pretending it was not there, and she touched it, finally, and flipped to the page with the vendor confirmations printed in plain language. And her eyes flicked down the lines and then back to me, and I held her gaze because I had earned this moment. An older uncle who never takes sides unless the ground is safe asked what needed to happen next to make sure our mother's finances were secure, and that was my cue. Not to gloat, but to move the ball. So I said the trustee would be implementing a simple control where any disbursement over a modest level would require joint authorization and receipts before release, and that this was standard practice, not a punishment. And that until then any existing transfers would be reviewed, and I added one more sentence that was not nice but was necessary, which was that I would personally notify the insurance and any relevant vendor if I found that their names had been used as cover for withdrawals. And the room heard the word notify the way a person hears a lock click, and I saw my mother open her mouth to argue and then close it again, because even she could hear that I was not making a mess. I was cleaning one up. I wish I could tell you that Emily apologized right then, or that my mother turned to me and said she had been wrong for years. But that is not how people like them operate. They do not pivot on a dime. They spin slowly while they look for a way to save face. And what happened instead was quieter and more satisfying, which was that relatives who have always treated me like the helper started directing their questions to me first, and Emily realized in real time that the authority she had, borrowed by being the favorite, had been repossessed by facts, and the look she gave me was not just angry, it was scared, because fear is what shows up when control leaves the room and does not say goodbye. I let the silence grow again, not because I wanted to drag it out, but because the silence was doing the work I had tried to do alone for years. And then I stood up and said I was going to step outside for a minute, and that anyone who had questions could read the pages themselves, and I took my glass of water and walked toward the doorway. And on my way out I passed Emily's husband as he leaned toward her and asked under his breath why the account number on the transfers matched the one on there. Joint statements, and I did not stop, I did not turn, I just kept walking, because the next words out of her mouth were not for me, and the next move was already lined up, and when my phone buzzed in my pocket with a new email notification, I knew exactly who it was and exactly what it meant, and I smiled for the first time all night, because the final piece had just clicked into place. The email was from the trustee, and even before I opened it I knew from the subject line that the guardrails I had asked for were already in motion, because it said confirmation of temporary hold pending beneficiary review, which is the kind of sentence that does not need flair or punctuation to change a family's balance of power. And when I stepped back into the room and felt the way conversation had dropped into low, uneven clusters, I did not clear my throat or make a speech or wave the message around like a trophy. I simply walked to the table, set my phone face down by my water, and told my aunt in a normal voice that the account was paused until documentation caught up with the story people were telling, and that, effective immediately, any transfer above a modest level would require joint sign-off and actual receipts, and, because I have learned to make the landing as quiet as the takeoff, I added that this was standard practice and not a punishment, which sounded bland enough for the relatives who hate conflict and sharp enough for the people who know exactly why bland is sometimes the sharpest blade in the drawer. Emily tried to recover by calling it an overreaction, a temporary glitch, a misunderstanding caused by me being too attached to rules, and I let her line up all the usual excuses because I knew what was coming next, which was the second vibration from my pocket signaling a reply from one of the vendors whose name had been used as cover for those urgent reimbursements, and the message was short and professional, confirming again that no invoice existed in our mother's name for the dates in question and politely asking to be informed if their brand was being used to justify private transfers, and I read it, took a breath that did not shake, and said to the table that I would be notifying vendors, the insurer, and the trustee of any misuse of their names, not to punish anyone but to make sure no one accidentally co-signed a false narrative, and that sentence did more in 10 seconds than years of my mother's speeches had done, because it made it clear that we were not dealing with a family squabble. We were dealing with facts that lived outside anyone's opinion. My mother told me I was humiliating her and that families should handle things privately, which would have stung on any other night. But I looked at her and calmly reminded her that she had just given a public toast ranking her daughters by loyalty while routine withdrawals were walking out the door under my sister's authorizations, and that if privacy mattered, it should have mattered before the money left, not after the questions arrived, and while she sputtered and reached for the only defense she understands, which is to claim that I am dramatic, the room did what it rarely does for me. It stayed with me, and I watched as cousins and uncles and friends, the same people who have always nodded along to her version of events, kept their eyes on the papers and their questions focused on the process instead of my tone, and that was when Emily's husband finally spoke in a voice that made even my mother straighten, asking why the account number on the transfers matched the one on their joint bank statements and whether she could provide the missing receipts tonight, and she said she would send them tomorrow, and I said that tomorrow would be fine as long as they were real. I will be honest with you, because pretending I am above the rush would be one more lie. I felt something close to satisfaction when the trustee called instead of emailing and asked, on speaker, that both beneficiaries join a brief call to confirm that all disbursements were on pause and that a joint authorization policy would be memorialized in an addendum presented for Mom's signature Monday morning, and I said yes. And my aunt said yes for my mother after getting a small nod, and Emily said nothing, which used to be my role, and when the trustee asked if any questions remained, I said there was one, which was whether previously approved reimbursements would be reviewed for compliance with the document's rules, and he said of course, with the kind of measured tone that tells you a professional has already seen enough to be cautious, and when the call ended the room did not bounce back into clinking and small talk. It stayed in that honest register where people either help or get out of the way, and for once I did not feel like a guest at my own family's party. Now here is the part that matters more than the paperwork, because this is where the revenge becomes something cleaner than payback and closer to protecting what should have been protected all along. And I leaned toward my mother and said quietly enough to keep it ours that the point of the folder was not to hurt her. It was to stop the hurt that would have arrived later when the money was gone, and the story was that life got expensive. And I told her that I was not asking for her gratitude, and I did not expect an apology. I was telling her that the rules had been changed back to what they were always supposed to be, and that from now on I would be signing every withdrawal that touched her future. And she could rage or sulk or call me names in the group chat later, but she would not be left vulnerable because my sister liked the way people clapped when she said she was a caregiver. And my mother stared at me the way a person stares at a language they do not speak yet but might learn if survival requires it, and for the first time I did not flinch under that stare. Emily, predictably, tried to flip the board by accusing me of trying to control her life, and I said I could not care less about her life. I cared about our mother's money and the document our father signed so that she would not have to beg or borrow. And I said if Emily had receipts, she could bring them, and if not, she could stop pretending that her image was charity. And a cousin actually exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath for years, and that sound, that small ordinary sound, landed for me like a stamp on a passport marking entry into a country I had never been allowed to visit, the country where I am taken seriously without having to perform gratitude for being tolerated. And I looked at Emily and felt no triumph in the petty sense, just a clear calm that comes when the wheel finally centers. In the days that followed, the aftermath unfolded in the boring ways real change often does, which is to say the trustee sent the addendum my mother signed after my aunt sat with her and walked through every line twice. Vendors replied with confirmations that helped close a loop that should never have been opened. A review of past transfers produced a number that made even Emily stop arguing, and funds that could be returned were returned. And when Emily called me to say I had ruined everything, I listened and then told her the only thing that mattered, which was that if everything could be ruined by returning money that never should have left, then everything was a fantasy, and I was done paying admission to her show. And I hung up before she could pull me into another circle. People have asked whether my mother ever apologized, whether Emily ever admitted anything, whether the family rewrote their understanding of us overnight, and the truth is that people do not transform just because paper changed direction. They adjust in increments, and there are still relatives who will talk about tone and timing as if tone and timing moved the money, and there are days when I replay the dinner and wonder if I could have picked a quieter moment, but then I remember the toast, where I was erased in a single sentence, and I think about the years that stretched behind it, and I know I would do it again, exactly the same way, because this was never about a scene, it was about finally making the story align with reality. So here is how it ends, not with a courtroom speech or a dramatic collapse, but with a set of rules that now require my signature and a family that knows the folder exists whether or not it sits on the table, and a mother who still favors my sister in small, tired ways, but also texts me questions she used to send to Emily, and a sister who posts fewer claims and does more actual caregiving because the money no longer applauds on cue, and me, walking out of that anniversary dinner with my head clear enough to feel the air and my hands steady enough to hold a life that I am no longer living in the margins of, and if you are waiting for me to say I forgave everyone or that we made a pretty group photo, you will be waiting a long time. Because I did not set out to make a picture, I set out to make a boundary, and I made it. And if you are asking whether it was too far, you are asking the wrong question, because the only question that matters is whether it worked, and it did, and that is the part one I'm keeping.